LaTosha Brown, political strategist and co-founder of Black Voters Matter. LaTosha Brown, welcome to the program. So answer me that first question that I posited. A passing storm or a fundamental problem with a major group of supporters and a major voting bloc?
You know, I think it's even deeper than that. I think we have a fundamental issue and a crisis of democracy in this nation. You know, and in fairness to Biden, and I've been critical of him, particularly on this handling of voting rights, and fairness to him, you know, he inherited a government that was functionally broken in many ways. With the Department of Education, most of the major departments, the previous administration had left it in disarray. When you look at the Postal Service, when you look at the issues that we had where the Department of Justice was actually performing in many ways like it was the personal legal firm for the former president. And so I do think that there was a lot that he was able to do to at least being able to stabilize to the federal government. In addition to that, I think there were some things that he did that were positive around the child tax credit, around getting the infrastructure plan passed, you know, those things that he put forward. You know, the challenge, and he's done a remarkable job really in terms of the lower courts, his appointments of the lower courts, not the Supreme Court, that are under the Supreme Court, you know, have actually been very, very progressive and he's been very judicious in that. You know, probably some of the best appointments I've seen since President Carter. And so I'm raising that because I think that there were major things that he's done. And then there have been challenges that I think that we have been saying, those of us who are political strategists and are doing work on the ground, where people are increasingly becoming frustrated, particularly Black voters, that there were core issues that Black voters cared about in the U.S. You know, the three core issues that we would hear over and over again was the issue around criminal justice reform, that as you can recall, and people can recall, in 2020, we had the largest uprising for the George Floyd murder, right? And as a result of that, there was a clarion call by the African-American voters that we wanted criminal justice reform. We've not seen that as of yet. The president still says that he's committed to that, but that is still out there and it has not been resolved. We also have a major issue around voting rights. What we saw in an election in 2020 where there was a historic turnout, where Black voters came out and were actually major drivers in the election result. And then when you look at places like Georgia, which I'm a resident in, you know, we were able to actually, that state made a major change in being able to bring 2 Democratic senators in, you know, and so as a result, there has been a backlash of voter suppression laws all across the country. We've seen it pass in 18 states, you know, and it's been introduced in over 28 states throughout the nation. You know, and so all those things he has not been able to have any movement on, which is why I think at this juncture, you know, I still think there's a clarion call and there's a frustration that is growing in the African-American community around those 2 issues. And then the third issue around closing the gap to economic inequities. And I think that he does have an opportunity with this judicial appointment to have the ability to appoint not just a Black woman to the Supreme Court, but really this is a moment that we need a Thurgood Marshall. This is a moment that we need the voice that is placed on the court that will actually be a stalwart voice for voting rights and civil rights in this country.
So I was going to ask you that question because he has made a promise and, you know, he said that he would do that. And that seems to be what's going to happen, that he will appoint the most qualified African-American woman to the Supreme Court. But do you think that that is enough to give him a necessary lift? And let me just, you know, the polls suggest, the latest one, that only 6 in 10 Black Americans say they approve of the president, down from 9 in 10 at the beginning of his presidency. You laid out a lot of the issues, but do you think he could get a good bump from his appointment to the Supreme Court first?
I think it depends on who he appoints. If he appoints someone that is going to be a safe appointment for the appeasement of the Republicans or the moderates, I don't think that would have an impact. I think a critical issue, a number one issue in our community is around the attacks that we're on voting rights attacks and the voter suppression right now. If he picks someone, if he makes a bold pick, you know, and pick someone that literally is going to be a bold voice around voting rights in this country, I do think that it can be a significant choice for him because that person can set the tone and the tenor of the Supreme Court. While we know that the Republican justices in the country on the Supreme Court have an advantage, what we want to see is we want to make sure that because we don't have the legislation right now, we're boxed in. We're going to have some more support on the courts. And I do believe he has an opportunity to actually get some lift in his likability within the African-American community at a point.
Okay, so On that issue of voting rights, and they've tried to do reform, but as you know better than I do, it's been stymied because of the makeup of Congress and also because of the opposition to the whole filibuster reform from members of his own party. But here's one view from one black voter. He's 73 years old. He's a professor. And it's George Hart who says, "I'm perplexed. At some points, I'm angry. I'm just so disillusioned. Biden let so much happen from the time he became president to the time that he actually introduced the measure. It was lost. And we are the ones, African Americans, black voters, who are going to pay the penalties." And then I spoke to, just earlier this month, to, you know, the great Jim Clyburn, the House Whip, who has been so responsible for so much movement and also, of course, for so much important backing of President Biden. Here's what he told me about this very issue on voting rights.
Today, people look back and they look at voting, which did not come until 65, and housing did not come until 68. And all of that is because people did not give up. Mm-hmm. And we may not get what we need to keep this democracy afloat tomorrow or the next day, but we are going to keep pressing forward.
So he's talking about the long game, LaTosha. Do you buy into that?
You know, I think that we certainly, I agree with the premise that we've got to continue to fight, but I do think that the frustration is rooted in the fact that there were many voting rights activists like myself that were wishing that the president had used the full weight of his office of where he is now earlier. That earlier to use that right after the election where there was the momentum behind his campaign, that right after the election in January, even 6th, that at that moment that what we saw as the insurrection, and there was a lot of anger and a lot of frustration, I think, on both sides that actually could have been a momentum for him as well. And we felt that he should have led from that space. But here we are now. The truth of the matter is he has made, I do believe that I think that he is now acknowledging that there has been a shift. Many of us have been saying there has been a shift in the political paradigm in this country. We have to recognize that democracy is under attack, that anytime voters are attacked because of who they voted for or how they voted, that is the beginning of a demise of a democracy, and that we have to make that a priority. I do believe that he and his administration, and I think to his own account that he said in his speech in Georgia that he had been silent for too long. I do believe that there is a change in the tone coming from the White House to actually make that a priority. What we've got to see is we've actually got to see some bold actions. That's why I believe that this pick for the Supreme Court is going to be critical.
So, LaTosha Brown, you mentioned the speech in Georgia, and it was a big speech, and as you say, you know, he admitted that he perhaps needed to have made that kind of bold public statement earlier. But you didn't go to that. I don't know whether the word boycott is the correct word to use, but neither you nor your organization, Black Voters Matter, nor people like Stacey Abrams and other very important black activists didn't attend. So I'm wondering whether that's a permanent disaffection, or whether you will, or I mean, I guess you will get out to try to get out the vote for the midterms. What's it going to be like trying to get out the black vote for the midterms?
No, it's going to be extremely challenging is what we raised. What we're seeing is we're seeing attacks on the local level, on the state level, and then now we have not the protection on the federal level. We've been saying from day one that we can't out-organize this. And part of us not going, it wasn't a boycott, you know, it wasn't to actually hurt the administration. It was to send a message of how serious we felt this voting rights issue is, and that at the end of the day, that is almost like you're fighting upstream. That is going to be extremely difficult and challenging because people are frustrated. They're frustrated that many of the things that were promised early on have not been delivered. But we also, let me say this, we're also, I think, politically astute enough to know that this is part of the Republicans' plan. At the end of the day, who is ultimately responsible for this have been the Republicans. They have been obstructionists. They have literally been working at every single level to make sure that they're marginalized voters in this country, that they're unraveling democracy, that they're literally basing everything on this big lie that President Trump actually had led, and coming out of that place and showing a lack of courage. And so those of us that really are part of the process, there's a frustration with the Biden administration, but the truth of the matter is this problem has been created by the Republicans and their attempt to continue to be obstructionists on every single issue. The fact that even when we're looking at the voting rights legislation, there were 16 Republicans that had voted for the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. So what has changed between that time and now that they're not supporting voting rights? We think that is a lack of courage, that the party has actually imploded. And now it's decided that it's going to be the party of division, of racism, and fundamentally is going to be anti-democratic.
Really interesting, and we're going to pursue that, obviously trying to get Republicans to talk about this. Very interesting. You might have noted, of course, the Republican governor of New Hampshire saying that he would not run for Senate. Is he Maine or New Hampshire? Chris Sununu, because he just did not want to be a Republican, roadblock for getting nothing done. LaTosha Brown, thank you so much indeed for joining us.